Ezra Whitmore jolted awake at 3:47 a.m., his weathered hand gripping the bed sheets as he watched his dog Shadow standing in perfect military formation by the window. The 120-pound creature wasn't pacing. He was counting, amber eyes tracking something invisible in the Montana darkness with predatory precision. This wasn't the injured puppy he'd rescued 18 months ago. Emma's coffee mug crashed to the kitchen floor when she arrived for her surprise visit, her scream piercing the morning silence as she saw what her father had been living with. The massive beast turned toward the sound, muscles coiled beneath midnight black fur, revealing canine teeth that belonged in nightmares. Ezra's mind flashed to Sarah's gentle warnings. "Honey, that pup's growing awfully fast." The empty dog food bowls, the missing livestock reports, the way neighbors crossed the street when they walked past. "Don't move," he whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. What if he'd never saved a dog at all? What if the creature sleeping on his dead wife's pillow was something far more dangerous and far more intelligent than he'd ever imagined? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Ezra Whitmore had been dying quietly for 3 years, ever since cancer took his Sarah on a Tuesday morning that felt like the world forgot how to breathe. At 71, the Korean War veteran found himself rationing conversations with his chickens just to hear another voice in the Cascade Mountain silence. His monthly Social Security check of $1,247 barely covered the $890 in heart medications that kept him upright, leaving precious little for the basics that used to matter when someone cared whether he woke up tomorrow. The cabin that once echoed with Sarah's humming now held only the tick of her grandmother's clock and the whisper of loneliness that crept through every corner like morning fog. Emma, their only daughter, called twice yearly, Christmas and his birthday, always with the same script about assisted living facilities and how a man his age shouldn't live alone in the wilderness. She never asked if he was happy. She never asked if he remembered what happiness felt like. "Sometimes the Lord sends what you need, not what you expect," Sarah used to say, and Ezra clung to those words like a drowning man clutches driftwood. That's what he told himself 18 months ago when he found the injured black puppy whimpering beside Highway 89, barely alive and smaller than a loaf of bread. Blood matted the tiny creature's fur, but those amber eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human. Ezra had wrapped the pup in Sarah's favorite quilt, the one that still smelled like her lavender soap, and drove through a spring blizzard to Dr. Patricia Wong's veterinary clinic. "This little one's a fighter," Dr. Wong had said, her gentle hands examining the puppy with professional tenderness. "German Shepherd mix, maybe some wolf heritage way back. Could grow up to be quite large." Quite large had become an understatement. Shadow now weighed 120 pounds of solid muscle, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder when alert. His midnight coat gleamed with health, and his amber eyes tracked movement with the precision of a seasoned hunter. Neighbors at Mabel's diner whispered about his size, about the way he moved through the forest without sound, about howls that didn't quite sound like any dog they'd ever heard. But Ezra saw only the companion who brought him the morning newspaper in gentle jaws, who slept on Sarah's side of the bed keeping the loneliness at bay, who listened to rambling stories about the old days with the patience of a saint. Shadow had saved Ezra from the silence that was slowly killing him, had given him purpose when every morning felt like punishment. "Family ain't always blood," Ezra would tell Shadow during their evening conversations by the fireplace, scratching behind ears that twitched with understanding. "But you're more family than I got left in this world." What Ezra didn't know was that 18 months of love had created a bond deeper than law, stronger than species, and more dangerous than either of them could imagine. The routine veterinary visit that would shatter Ezra's world began like any other Tuesday morning. Shadow rode in the passenger seat of Ezra's weathered pickup truck, his massive head hanging out the window to catch scents that told stories only he could read. Dr. Patricia Wong greeted them at the Cascade Animal Clinic with her usual professional warmth, though Ezra noticed her eyes lingering on Shadow's size with what looked like growing concern. "How's our boy doing, Ezra?" she asked, running experienced hands along Shadow's flanks. The examination seemed routine until her fingers found something behind Shadow's left shoulder that made her pause. "Has Shadow been experiencing any discomfort here? These muscle formations are unusual." Shadow stood perfectly still during the examination, those intelligent amber eyes tracking Dr. Wong's every movement with an alertness that seemed almost human. When she checked his teeth, Ezra couldn't help but notice how the veterinarian's expression grew increasingly troubled. The canines were longer than seemed normal, more pointed, designed for tearing rather than the crushing action of typical domestic breeds. "Ezra, I'd like to run some additional tests," Dr. Wong said carefully, her voice carrying undertones that made Ezra's chest tighten. "Shadow's bone density readings are off the charts, and his muscle development is unlike anything I've seen in German Shepherds. I'm wondering if we might want to do a DNA analysis just to better understand his heritage." The DNA test results arrived 3 days later, and Dr. Wong's phone call came at sunset when Ezra was sharing his evening coffee with Shadow on the front porch. Her voice shook with disbelief and something that sounded like fear. "Ezra, you need to come in immediately. We need to discuss Shadow's test results in person. And Ezra, please don't bring Shadow with you." The drive to the clinic felt like the longest 20 minutes of Ezra's life. His heart medication hadn't been working as well lately, and the stress made his chest feel like a vice was slowly tightening around his ribs. Dr. Wong met him at the door, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Ezra, please sit down," she said, guiding him to a chair in her private office. The DNA test results lay spread across her desk like evidence of a crime. "There's no easy way to say this. Shadow isn't a German Shepherd mix. He isn't a mix of anything domestic. According to these tests, Shadow is 100% gray wolf, Canis lupus, no domestic dog genetics whatsoever." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. The coffee mug in his hands began to shake, sending brown liquid spilling across the documents that proved his beloved companion was something the law considered dangerous, something federal authorities would classify as contraband wildlife. "That can't be right, Doc. Shadow's gentle as a lamb. He's never hurt a fly. He brings me my newspaper every morning." Dr. Wong's expression softened with sympathy, but her professional duty remained unchanged. "Ezra, I understand this is shocking, but the tests don't lie. Shadow is a fully wild wolf, somehow living in domestic circumstances. This creates serious legal implications. Federal law requires me to report this to the Fish and Wildlife Service within 24 hours. Keeping a wild wolf without permits is a federal felony." "Federal felony?" Ezra's voice cracked like autumn leaves. "Doc, that wolf saved my life. After Sarah died, I was ready to follow her. Shadow gave me reason to wake up every morning." "He's not dangerous. He's family." The veterinarian pulled out a thick folder filled with regulations and legal codes. "Ezra, I believe you about Shadow's temperament, but the law doesn't make exceptions for emotional bonds. Gray wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Unauthorized possession carries penalties of up to $50,000 in fines and possible imprisonment. Even if Shadow has never shown aggression, his natural predatory instincts could emerge at any time. Adult male wolves can exert 1,500 pounds of bite force. They're apex predators, not pets." The reality of his situation crashed over Ezra like an avalanche. His Social Security check couldn't cover a parking ticket, let alone federal fines. His heart condition made prison essentially a death sentence. But the thought of losing Shadow, of surrendering the only living creature that had brought warmth back to his cold, empty cabin, felt like losing Sarah all over again. "How long do I have?" Ezra asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Wong looked at the regulations with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. 72 hours. After I file the report, federal agents will arrive with authorization to seize Shadow and transport him to a wildlife facility. Ezra, I'm so sorry. If there was any other way. Driving home in the gathering darkness, Ezra's mind raced through impossible options. Shadow was waiting on the porch, tail wagging with the same joy he'd shown every day for 18 months. As Ezra climbed the steps, Shadow pressed his massive head against the old man's legs in their familiar greeting ritual. "What are we gonna do, boy?" Ezra whispered, scratching behind Shadow's ears as amber eyes gazed up at him with complete trust and unconditional love. Agent Mitchell Kane arrived at Ezra's cabin precisely 48 hours after Dr. Wong filed her mandatory report, his federal credentials gleaming like badges of doom in the morning sunlight. Kane was a man built from granite and government regulations, his weathered face carved by decades of enforcing wildlife protection laws across the American West. At 53, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who had never met a rule he wouldn't follow, never encountered a situation that couldn't be solved by strict adherence to federal protocol. "Mr. Whitmore," Kane said, his voice carrying the authority of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, "I'm here regarding the unauthorized possession of a gray wolf on your property. I understand Dr. Wong has already explained the legal implications of your situation." Shadow emerged from behind the cabin at the sound of strange voices, moving with the fluid grace that Ezra had always attributed to excellent breeding. Now, watching Kane's sharp intake of breath at Shadow's size and bearing, Ezra saw his beloved companion through different eyes. Shadow wasn't just large. He was magnificent in a way that belonged to wilderness documentaries, not front porches in rural Montana. His amber eyes assessed Kane with intelligence that seemed to catalog threat levels and escape routes simultaneously. "Agent Kane, I appreciate you coming out here personally," Ezra said, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the medication bottle rattling in his pocket. Only 14 pills remaining of his heart medication, with 2 weeks until his Social Security check could cover a refill. "But I need you to understand something. Shadow here isn't just some wild animal I picked up for kicks. He was dying when I found him. I nursed him back to health, and he's been nothing but loyal and gentle ever since." Kane's expression remained professionally neutral, though Ezra caught something flickering in the agent's gray eyes, something personal that had nothing to do with federal wildlife regulations. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been doing this job for 22 years. I've seen what wolves can do when their predatory instincts kick in. That animal represents a clear and present danger to your community, regardless of his current behavior." The words stung because Kane delivered them with the certainty of someone who had witnessed tragedy. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested personal experience rather than textbook knowledge. When Kane looked at Shadow, his jaw tightened with barely suppressed emotion that seemed far too intense for professional concern. "I've seen what happens when people convince themselves that wild predators can be domesticated," Kane continued, pulling out official forms that would transform Shadow from family member to federal evidence. "The law exists for good reasons, Mr. Whitmore. Gray wolves are apex predators with bite forces exceeding 1,500 pounds per square inch. Their pack hunting instincts are hardwired into their DNA. No amount of human affection can override millions of years of evolutionary programming." Shadow seemed to sense the threat implicit in Kane's presence. The wolf positioned himself between Ezra and the federal agent, not aggressively but with the calculated awareness of a creature assessing potential danger. His massive head remained level, ears forward, amber eyes never leaving Kane's face. The display of protective intelligence was both touching and terrifying in its implications. "Agent Kane, I understand your concerns about safety," Ezra said, desperation creeping into his voice as he realized this man held Shadow's life in his hands. "But Shadow has been living peacefully in this community for 18 months. He's never shown aggression toward humans. Hell, he saved Mrs. Henderson from a black bear last spring, and he's gentle as a lamb with the school children when they walk past." Kane's professional facade cracked slightly at the mention of children. "Children?" His voice carried sharp alarm. "Mr. Whitmore, you've allowed a wild wolf to interact with children. Do you understand the liability you've created? The potential for catastrophic injury?" "He protects them," Ezra insisted, his own protective instincts flaring. "Just last month, Shadow guided the Patterson boy back to the trail when he got turned around in the woods. That wolf has more sense and compassion than most humans I know." But Kane was already shaking his head, pulling out his phone to make notes about child endangerment that would strengthen the federal case for immediate seizure. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm required by federal law to inform you that you have 24 hours to surrender the animal voluntarily. If you fail to comply, federal marshals will arrive with authorization to seize the wolf by force. Additionally, you'll face federal charges for unlawful possession of protected wildlife, with potential penalties including substantial fines and imprisonment." The financial implications hit Ezra like a sledgehammer to the chest. His total net worth consisted of the cabin Sarah had inherited from her father, a 12-year-old pickup truck, and $847 in his checking account. The idea of federal fines exceeding $50,000 was beyond comprehension. It might as well have been $1 million. "Agent Kane, please." Ezra's voice broke with the weight of approaching loss. "This wolf is all I have left. My wife died 3 years ago. My daughter thinks I'm losing my mind living out here alone. Shadow brought me back from the edge of giving up entirely. Can't there be some kind of compromise, some way to keep him legally?" Kane's expression softened almost imperceptibly, but his response remained inflexible. "The law doesn't provide for emotional attachments to wildlife, Mr. Whitmore. If you wanted a companion animal, you should have adopted from a shelter, not rescued what you assumed was an abandoned puppy." As Kane prepared to leave, Shadow moved to the edge of the porch, his massive frame silhouetted against the afternoon sky. A low sound rumbled from his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine, but something that communicated complex emotions no domestic dog could express. The sound made Kane freeze, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "That's not aggressive," Ezra said quickly, recognizing Shadow's vocalization. "He's trying to communicate. He knows something's wrong, but he's not threatening anyone." Kane studied Shadow with the intensity of someone memorizing details for an official report. 24 hours, Mr. Whitmore. After that, federal marshals will handle the seizure, and the situation becomes significantly more complicated for everyone involved." After Kane's government vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, Ezra sank into his porch chair with the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him. Shadow padded over and rested his massive head on Ezra's knee, amber eyes gazing up with complete trust and unconditional love. "What am I supposed to do, boy?" Ezra whispered, scratching behind Shadow's ears as the reality of their situation settled like winter cold in his bones. "How do I choose between keeping you and staying out of federal prison?" Shadow's tail wagged once, the same single, deliberate wag he'd given that first day when Ezra named him. It was a gesture of faith, of absolute confidence that his human would find a way through this crisis. But as the Montana sun set behind the mountains, Ezra felt the crushing weight of loving something the law considered contraband. something that could be taken from him by force if love wasn't enough to find another way. The news of Ezra's predicament spread through the mountain community like wildfire in drought season. By Thursday morning, Mabel's Diner had become an unofficial town hall where neighbors debated the fate of the man and wolf who had become local legends. The cramped restaurant buzzed with conversations that split families and friendships down lines nobody had expected to draw. At table 1, retired teacher Margaret Foster passionately defended Shadow's character. "That wolf saved my grandson Billy from drowning in Miller Creek last summer," she declared, her coffee growing cold as she gestured emphatically. "Billy slipped on wet rocks and went under. Shadow jumped in without hesitation, pulled that boy to shore by his jacket collar. You tell me that's the behavior of a vicious predator." But table 2 told different stories that chilled the morning air. Rancher Tom Bradley leaned forward with the gravity of someone who'd lost livestock to predators. "Y'all are thinking with your hearts instead of your heads," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "I've lost 12 head of cattle to wolves over the years. They're killing machines, pure and simple, size and intelligence like Shadow's got. He could take down a full-grown elk, let alone a child who stumbles in the wrong direction." The financial reality of Ezra's situation had sparked something unprecedented in the tight-knit community. Sarah Mitchell, Mabel's daughter who managed the diner's social media, had created a GoFundMe page titled "Help Ezra Keep Shadow" that had exploded across the internet overnight. The page featured a photograph of Ezra and Shadow sitting together on their porch at sunset, the old man's weathered hand resting on the wolf's massive head while amber eyes gazed at the camera with almost human intelligence. $23,000, Sarah announced to the breakfast crowd, reading updates from her phone. "We've raised $23,000 from people all over the world. Comments are pouring in from folks who understand that love doesn't recognize species boundaries." The donations came with stories that brought tears to hardened mountain folk. A widow in Florida sent $50 with a note. "I know what it's like to have an animal save you from dying of loneliness." A veteran in Texas contributed $200. Some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the odds. Children from as far away as Japan sent dollar bills with drawings of wolves and hearts, but money couldn't change federal law, and everyone knew it. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh visited the diner Wednesday afternoon, her presence drawing curious stares and worried whispers. A practical woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news, she accepted Mabel's coffee with the weary resignation of a public servant caught between compassion and duty. "I understand the community's feelings about Mr. Whitmore and his wolf," she said to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "But federal wildlife laws exist for compelling reasons. Gray wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Unauthorized possession is a federal felony that carries mandatory minimum sentences. Even if I wanted to find a loophole, federal prosecutors would step in immediately." Dr. Patricia Wong sat in the corner booth, her veterinary training warring with her growing attachment to both patient and owner. The DNA test results haunted her professional conscience, but watching Ezra's deteriorating health over the past week had awakened her deepest healing instincts. "Rebecca, what if we could prove that Shadow poses no threat to public safety? What if expert behavioral analysis demonstrated that his socialization has overridden his predatory instincts?" "Patricia, you're a brilliant veterinarian, but you're not a federal judge," Walsh replied with gentle firmness. "The law doesn't make exceptions for well-behaved wildlife. If it did, every person who wanted to keep a tiger or bear could claim their pet was different, special, misunderstood." Meanwhile, Agent Kane had taken up temporary residence at the Mountain View Motel, his presence in the community creating an undercurrent of tension that affected everyone. Local children pointed and whispered when his government sedan drove past. Shop owners served him with polite coldness. Even Pastor Williams, typically welcoming to strangers, had delivered a Sunday sermon about compassion that everyone understood was directed at the federal agent. Cain spent his days documenting evidence for his case file, photographing Shadow's massive paw prints in the mud, measuring bite marks on elk bones found in the forest, interviewing neighbors about any aggressive behaviors they might have witnessed, but the evidence kept contradicting his expectations. Every person he interviewed described Shadow's gentle nature, his protective instincts toward children, his loyalty to Ezra that bordered on devotion. The most compelling testimony came from an unexpected source. 8-year-old Emma Patterson approached Cain outside the post office, her small hand tugging at his jacket sleeve with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Mister, are you the man who wants to take Shadow away?" Cain knelt to her eye level, his professional mask slipping as he faced the innocence in her blue eyes. "I'm just doing my job, sweetheart. Making sure everyone stays safe." "But Shadow keeps us safe," Emma insisted, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of a child stating obvious truth. "When me and Tommy got lost in the woods last month, Shadow found us and led us home. He stayed with us all night when we were scared, and he was warm and soft like the biggest teddy bear ever. He licked my face when I cried, and his tail wagged when Daddy finally found us." The encounter shook something loose in Cain's carefully constructed professional armor. That evening, alone in his motel room, he found himself staring at a photograph that never left his wallet, a little girl with blonde pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, frozen forever at age 4. Sophia had loved animals with the pure joy that only children possess. She would have adored Shadow, would have seen him as the ultimate fairy tale guardian, rather than the predator Cain's broken heart insisted on seeing. Back at the cabin, Ezra was fighting his own battles on multiple fronts. His heart medication was down to 7 pills, and the stress of the situation had triggered episodes that left him gasping for breath and clutching his chest. Emma, his daughter, had driven up from Portland with a U-Haul trailer and grim determination to relocate her father to assisted living, whether he cooperated or not. "Dad, this is exactly why you can't live alone up here," Emma said, her frustration boiling over as she gestured at the federal paperwork scattered across the kitchen table. "You're harboring a dangerous wild animal, facing federal charges, and your heart condition is deteriorating. Enough is enough." Shadow lay in his usual spot by the fireplace, but his amber eyes tracked every movement, every raised voice, every gesture that suggested conflict in his human family. The wolf's intelligence was becoming more apparent under stress. He understood that his presence was causing the discord, that his existence threatened the peace of the people he loved. "Emma, you don't understand," Ezra replied, his voice weak from another heart episode that morning. "Shadow isn't the problem. He's the solution. Before he came into my life, I was just waiting to die. Now I have purpose, companionship, reason to get up every morning. Taking him away won't make me safer. It'll kill me just as surely as any heart attack." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door that made everyone freeze. Through the window they could see Agent Cain's government sedan parked in the driveway, official papers visible in his hand. The 24-hour deadline had arrived, but Cain wasn't alone. Behind him stood Dr. James Clearwater, a wildlife biologist from the State University whose reputation preceded him into every room. Clearwater specialized in wolf behavior and reintroduction programs, his expertise sought by government agencies across the country. His presence suggested that Cain was taking Ezra's situation more seriously than his rigid demeanor had indicated. "Mr. Whitmore," Cain said as Ezra opened the door, his voice carrying less authority than it had 2 days earlier. "This is Dr. Clearwater from the university. He's agreed to conduct an independent behavioral assessment of your wolf before we proceed with seizure. Shadow rose from his position by the fireplace, moving with the fluid grace that still took Ezra's breath away. The wolf approached the strangers with calm curiosity, his massive head tilted slightly as if assessing their intentions. Doctor Clearwater knelt slowly, extending his hand for Shadow to investigate. What happened next surprised everyone present. Shadow approached the wildlife expert with the same gentle curiosity he showed to children, his tail wagging in slow, measured beats that spoke of cautious acceptance rather than submission or aggression. When Clearwater spoke softly to him, Shadow's ears pricked forward with the attentiveness of a creature genuinely interested in communication. "Remarkable," Dr. Clearwater murmured, his trained eyes cataloging every aspect of Shadow's behavior. "Agent Kane, this animal is displaying socialization patterns I've never documented in wild wolves. His stress indicators are minimal despite the presence of strangers in his territory. His body language suggests protective concern for Mr. Whitmore rather than territorial aggression." The assessment continued for 2 hours, with Dr. Clearwater observing Shadow's interactions with Ezra, his response to various stimuli, his behavior around the cabin that had become his territory. The wolf demonstrated intelligence that bordered on the uncanny, fetching Ezra's reading glasses when the old man squinted at papers, positioning himself between Ezra and the door when strangers were present, even attempting to bring Ezra his heart medication when stress symptoms became apparent. "This case is unprecedented in my experience," Dr. Clearwater finally announced, his academic objectivity clearly shaken by what he'd witnessed. "This wolf has not only been successfully socialized to human companionship, he's developed emotional bonds and protective behaviors that typically require generational breeding programs to achieve. The implications for our understanding of wolf psychology and human-animal bonding are staggering." Agent Kane studied his notes with the expression of a man whose certainties were crumbling. Everything he thought he knew about wolves, about the dangers they represented, about the necessity of rigid enforcement, was being challenged by the evidence of his own eyes. As evening approached and federal protocol demanded a decision, the 3 men sat around Ezra's kitchen table while Shadow rested his massive head on his human's lap, amber eyes reflecting the lamplight with ancient wisdom and modern love. The choice between law and compassion, between protocol and humanity, hung in the mountain air like storm clouds gathering for a battle that would determine the fate of an impossible family that had found each other against all odds. The emergency town meeting called for Friday evening at 7 o'clock drew the largest crowd in Cascade Community Center's 40-year history. Every folding chair was occupied, with dozens more residents standing along the walls, their faces reflecting the deep divisions that had fractured the mountain community over the past week. The air crackled with tension as neighbors who had shared potluck dinners and helped each other through harsh winters found themselves on opposite sides of an impossible question: should love between species override federal law? Mayor Patricia Hendricks called the meeting to order with the weary authority of a woman who had refereed countless local disputes, but never one with federal agents in attendance. Agent Kane sat in the front row with his case files and legal documentation, while Dr. Clearwater occupied the adjacent seat with behavioral assessment reports that could determine Shadow's fate. Ezra entered the hall with Shadow at his side, the wolf's presence causing a ripple of whispers and pointing fingers that followed them to seats near the back. The pro-Shadow testimonies began with Margaret Foster, whose grandson's near-drowning rescue had become legendary in the community. "I've lived in these mountains for 63 years, she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of local history. "I've seen children saved by that wolf, lost hikers guided back to safety, and an old man brought back from the edge of despair. If we're going to judge Shadow by his actions rather than his species, then he's proven himself a better neighbor than some humans I could mention. Pastor Williams rose to speak, his Sunday pulpit voice filling the community center with resonant conviction. The good book tells us that we shall know them by their fruits. For 18 months, Shadow's fruits have been protection, companionship, and healing. This wolf has shown more Christian charity than many who claim to follow the faith. Are we really going to punish love because it doesn't fit our legal definitions? But the opposition voices carried their own compelling truth. Rancher Tom Bradley stepped forward with photographs of cattle carcasses, the stark images projected onto the wall behind him. "Y'all are letting sentiment cloud your judgment," he said, his weathered hands shaking with emotion. "Wolves don't choose favorites. They don't make exceptions. When hunger strikes or territorial instincts kick in, your beloved Shadow will revert to what millions of years of evolution programmed him to be, a killing machine." Sarah Mitchell, the young mother who managed the GoFundMe campaign, presented updates that stunned even the organizers. $57,000 from donors in 43 states and 12 countries, she announced, her voice breaking with emotion. The messages are overwhelming. People see Ezra and Shadow as symbols of something pure in a world that's forgotten how to love unconditionally. The donations had brought stories that revealed the deeper hunger Shadow's tale addressed. A 90-year-old man in Florida wrote, "I've been alone for 8 years since my wife passed. Every day I pray for a companion like Shadow, something to love and be loved by." A single mother in Ohio contributed her last $20 with a note. "My son has autism and struggles to connect with people. Shadow gives him hope that love can transcend any barrier." Dr. Clearwater's professional assessment carried the weight of scientific authority when he addressed the assembly. "I've studied wolf behavior for 27 years, and I've never documented socialization patterns like Shadow displays. His emotional bonding with Mr. Whitmore appears to have overridden fundamental predatory instincts." However, he paused, his academic honesty demanding balance, "this represents a sample size of one. We cannot extrapolate from Shadow's exceptional case to assume other wolves would demonstrate similar behavioral modifications." Agent Kane finally rose to present the federal government's position, his rigid posture betraying none of the internal conflict that had been eating at him since little Emma Patterson's testimony. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your emotional attachment to this situation, but federal wildlife protection laws exist because individual exceptions can lead to catastrophic consequences. Gray wolves are apex predators with bite forces exceeding 1,500 pounds per square inch. One miscalculation, one moment when instinct overrides socialization, and we could face tragedy that destroys lives and families." His words carried personal pain that few in the audience could detect, but Ezra heard the tremor beneath Kane's professional delivery. The federal agent wasn't just enforcing protocol, he was fighting his own demons, his own losses that had shaped his rigid interpretation of wildlife law. The testimonies continued past 9 o'clock, with voices rising and tempers flaring as the community grappled with questions that had no easy answers. Mrs. Henderson described how Shadow had positioned himself between her and a black bear that wandered onto her porch, never attacking but intimidating the larger predator until it retreated. Young Tommy Patterson tearfully recounted how Shadow had stayed with him and Emma during their night lost in the woods, sharing his body warmth and comfort until rescue arrived. But other voices spoke of legitimate fears. Single mother Janet Morrison worried about her toddler's safety during walks to the mailbox. Elderly Mrs. Carmichael described sleepless nights listening to howls that seemed to call to something wild and dangerous in the surrounding forest. "How long before Shadow answers those calls?" she asked, her voice shaking with genuine terror. How long before our mountain home becomes a hunting ground? The debate reached its crescendo when Emma Patterson stood to address Agent Kane directly. At 8 years old, she commanded attention with the fearless honesty that only children possess. "Mr. Kane, my daddy says you have a little girl, too. Would you want someone to take away your little girl's best friend just because other people were scared?" Kane's composed mask cracked visibly, his gray eyes filling with pain that had festered for 2 years. "Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups have to make hard decisions to keep everyone safe, even when those decisions break our hearts." "But Shadow keeps us safe," Emma insisted, her small voice carrying absolute conviction. "He's like a guardian angel with fur and big teeth." "Angels are supposed to be scary to bad things and gentle to good things, right?" The child's words hit Kane like a physical blow. In his wallet, Sophia's photograph seemed to burn against his chest. Another little girl who had believed in guardian angels, who had trusted that the adults in her life would keep her safe from the very predators he now spent his career hunting. As the formal presentations concluded, Mayor Hendricks called for the community vote that would determine Shadow's immediate future. The ballot was simple. Should the town of Cascade officially petition federal authorities for an exception to wildlife protection laws, allowing Shadow to remain with Ezra Whitmore under supervised conditions? The voting process took place in tense silence, with paper ballots dropped into an old shoebox that had served the community for decades of local decisions. Dr. Clearwater and Agent Kane served as neutral observers, while Mayor Hendricks counted votes that would either validate an unprecedented human-animal bond or acknowledge that some laws existed beyond the reach of love and good intentions. The vote stands at 47 in favor of petitioning for an exception, 43 opposed, Mayor Hendricks announced, her voice heavy with the weight of a community divided almost exactly in half. "The margin is close enough to reflect our genuine uncertainty about the right course of action." Agent Kane rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man carrying impossible burdens. "Mr. Whitmore, the community vote doesn't change federal law, but it does influence how I proceed with enforcement. I'm prepared to grant a 72-hour extension while I consult with my superiors about possible alternatives to immediate seizure." The announcement brought cautious relief tinged with the knowledge that they had only delayed the inevitable. If federal wildlife laws didn't bend for local politics or emotional testimonies, no matter how compelling, Shadow would eventually face the same fate that awaited all wild animals living outside their designated habitats. As the meeting dispersed, Ezra found himself surrounded by neighbors offering support, condolences, and promises to continue fighting regardless of federal pressure. Shadow pressed against his legs, the wolf's massive head providing warmth and comfort that penetrated deeper than any human consolation. Walking home under star-filled Montana skies, Ezra felt the crushing weight of loving something the law considered contraband. Shadow padded silently beside him, amber eyes reflecting moonlight with ancient wisdom that understood the approaching separation even if he couldn't comprehend the human complexities that made it inevitable. "What are we going to do, boy?" Ezra whispered into the mountain silence, his weathered hand resting on Shadow's head as they climbed the steps to their cabin home. "How do you fight for love when love itself has become the crime?" Shadow's answering whine carried all the sorrow of wild things forced to live within human boundaries, all the confusion of a heart that had chosen domestication over freedom, only to discover that choice itself might be the cruelest illusion of all. The federal marshals arrived at dawn on Tuesday morning like harbingers of institutional justice, their black vehicles forming a careful perimeter around Ezra's cabin, while mist still clung to the mountain valleys below. Agent Kane emerged from the lead car carrying tranquilizer equipment and transport authorization that had been signed by judges who would never see the amber eyes they were condemning to captivity. Dr. Clearwater accompanied the enforcement team in his capacity as wildlife expert, his face reflecting the professional conflict of a man forced to enable what his scientific conscience questioned. Shadow sensed the approaching danger before Ezra fully awakened. The wolf positioned himself at the cabin's front window, his massive frame silhouetted against the early morning light as he tracked the movements of armed strangers surrounding his territory. A low rumble emanated from his chest. Not aggression, but the deep vocalization of a creature preparing to defend everything he held sacred in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. "Easy, boy," Ezra whispered, his weathered hands shaking as he struggled to dress himself with dignity before facing what felt like an execution squad. His heart medication bottle contained only 3 pills, and the stress had triggered chest pains that radiated down his left arm like lightning. We knew this day was coming. Time to face it like the family we are. The knock on the door carried the authority of federal law enforcement, but Kane's voice held notes of reluctance that hadn't been present during his initial visit. "Mr. Whitmore, we have authorization to seize the wolf and transport him to the Federal Wildlife Facility in Colorado. Please open the door and keep the animal restrained while we complete the transfer." Ezra opened the door with Shadow pressed against his side, the wolf's amber eyes taking inventory of every federal agent, every piece of equipment, every potential threat to his human family. The sight of the massive predator caused several marshals to shift uncomfortably, their hands instinctively moving toward weapons that wouldn't be necessary if this proceeded according to plan. "Gentlemen, I understand you're doing your jobs," Ezra said, his voice carrying the dignity of a man who had faced Korean War combat and considered federal bureaucracy a lesser enemy. "But I need you to understand that you're not just taking a wolf today. You're taking the only family I have left, the only reason I've had to keep breathing since my Sarah passed." Dr. Clearwater stepped forward with the tranquilizer rifle, his academic training warring against everything he'd witnessed about Shadow's exceptional nature. "Mr. Whitmore, the sedative will ensure Shadow experiences minimal stress during transport. He'll be unconscious within minutes and wake up in a secure facility designed specifically for his species' needs." "His species' needs," Ezra repeated bitterly, kneeling beside Shadow to scratch behind the wolf's ears one final time. "Doc, his species' needs include loyalty, companionship, and protecting the pack he chose. Your facility going to provide that?" Shadow seemed to understand the gravity of the situation with intelligence that continued to astound the assembled officials. Instead of fleeing or showing aggression, the wolf pressed closer to Ezra, offering comfort to the human who was about to lose everything. His massive head rested against the old man's chest, amber eyes gazing upward with complete trust that his person would somehow find a solution to this incomprehensible crisis. "Mr. Whitmore, please step away from the animal so we can proceed safely," Kane instructed, his professional demeanor masking the personal turmoil that had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights. The photograph of Sophia in his wallet seemed to burn against his chest, a reminder of another little girl who had trusted adults to protect her from predators that ultimately proved unstoppable. The moment of separation arrived with devastating swiftness. As Ezra struggled to his feet, his heart condition triggered a severe episode that dropped him to his knees, gasping for breath while clutching his chest. Shadow's response was immediate and instinctive. The wolf positioned himself over Ezra's collapsed form, creating a protective barrier that prevented the federal agents from approaching. "Stand back!" Marshal Rodriguez shouted, his weapon drawn as Shadow displayed the first truly aggressive behavior anyone had witnessed. The wolf's lips pulled back to reveal canine teeth designed by millions of years of evolution for lethal efficiency, his amber eyes blazing with protective fury that transformed the gentle companion into something terrifying and magnificent. "Don't shoot," Dr. Clearwater commanded, recognizing the critical difference between predatory aggression and defensive protection. He's defending his pack member, not attacking. Lower your weapons before you trigger a genuine attack response. The standoff lasted eternal seconds, while Ezra fought to regain his breath and composure, his weathered hands gripping Shadow's fur like a lifeline to consciousness. The wolf's protective stance never wavered, his attention divided between monitoring the federal agents and providing physical support to his struggling human. "I'm okay, boy," Ezra finally managed to whisper, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Let them do what they came to do." Shadow's amber eyes searched Ezra's face with intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended species boundaries, an acceptance that love sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice of letting go. The wolf stepped back from his protective position, moving to Ezra's side with dignity intact despite the approaching capture. When Dr. Clearwater raised the tranquilizer rifle, Shadow didn't flee or struggle. Instead, he pressed his massive head against Ezra's leg one final time, amber eyes holding his human's gaze with unwavering devotion. "Thank you," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking with grief that had been building since Dr. Wong's devastating phone call. "Thank you for making me remember what love feels like." The dart found its mark with clinical precision, and Shadow's legs began to wobble within seconds as the sedative coursed through his system. But even as consciousness faded, the wolf's eyes never left Ezra's face, maintaining that profound connection until the drugs finally claimed him. The transfer to the transport cage occurred with mechanical efficiency that stripped away every trace of the emotional bonds that had defined Shadow's existence for 18 months. Federal agents lifted the unconscious wolf with practiced care, securing him in a container designed for dangerous wildlife rather than beloved family members. Ezra collapsed into his porch chair as the federal convoy prepared to depart, his heart medication doing nothing to ease the pain of watching his purpose in life disappear into government custody. Neighbors had gathered at respectful distances, their faces reflecting the community grief of witnessing institutional power override human love. Agent Kane paused at his vehicle, looking back at the broken old man whose crime had been loving something the law considered contraband. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know that Shadow will receive excellent care at the facility. They specialize in wildlife rehabilitation and have experience with wolves displaying unusual behaviors." "Agent Kane," Ezra replied, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Can they give him what he needs most? Can they love him like family? Can they make him feel like he belongs somewhere?" Kane had no answer for questions that exposed the fundamental inadequacy of institutional solutions to matters of the heart. He climbed into his vehicle with the weight of Sophia's memory and Ezra's grief pressing down on his shoulders like the accumulated sorrow of every impossible choice his career had demanded. As the federal convoy disappeared down the mountain road, Ezra remained on his porch, surrounded by neighbors who offered comfort that couldn't penetrate the fortress of loss surrounding his heart. The cabin, that had been transformed from tomb to home by Shadow's presence, felt like a mausoleum again, filled with echoes of companionship that had been legally terminated by forces beyond local understanding or federal compassion. Emma arrived from Portland that afternoon to find her father staring at Shadow's empty food bowl, his heart medication forgotten on the kitchen counter as he surrendered to grief that made cardiac episodes seem trivial by comparison. The daughter who had pushed for assisted living now understood that removing her father from this mountain would complete the destruction that federal law had begun. "Dad," she whispered, kneeling beside the chair where Ezra sat motionless. "I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what Shadow meant to you." "He was my family, Emma," Ezra replied, his voice empty of everything except loss. "The law says you can't love something wild, but they never asked Shadow if he wanted to be loved. They never asked if 18 months of choosing us over freedom might mean something important." The mountain cabin settled into silence, broken only by the ticking of Sarah's grandmother's clock, marking time that no longer held meaning for the man who had learned to live again, only to have life legally confiscated by well-meaning strangers who confused protection with imprisonment. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Shadow's paw prints in the mud with white erasure that felt like nature's acknowledgement that some bonds were too profound for the world to bear witness to their destruction. 3 days after Shadow's seizure, Dr. James Clearwater received a phone call that shattered everything he thought he understood about wolf behavior and federal wildlife management. The caller was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, director of the Colorado Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, her voice tight with professional concern and personal bewilderment. "James, I need you to come to Colorado immediately," Dr. Martinez said, her usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of unprecedented circumstances. "Your wolf, the one taken from Montana, we've never seen anything like his behavior. He's not eating, not responding to handlers, and his depression levels are off every chart we use to measure wildlife psychological distress." Shadow had been placed in a specialized enclosure designed for large predators, complete with natural vegetation, running water, and environmental enrichments that typically helped captured wolves adjust to captivity. But instead of exploring his new territory or establishing dominance patterns, Shadow spent his days pressed against the fence closest to the facility's entrance, amber eyes fixed on the road that had brought him to this place of exile. "He's not exhibiting normal wild wolf behaviors," Dr. Martinez continued, her scientific training struggling to explain phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal psychology. Captive wolves typically show territorial marking, pack hierarchy establishment, or aggressive responses to confinement. Shadow shows none of these patterns. Instead, he displays what can only be described as grief. The revelation hit Dr. Clearwater like a physical blow. His behavioral assessment had focused on Shadow's exceptional socialization with humans, but he had underestimated the depth of emotional bonding that 18 months of family life had created. Shadow wasn't just a wolf who had learned to live with humans. He had psychologically bonded with Ezra as pack family in ways that captivity couldn't replace or institutional care couldn't heal. "There's something else, James," Dr. Martinez added, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried implications no wildlife manual had prepared her for. "Shadow has been attempting to communicate. Not howling, not typical wolf vocalizations, but sounds that seem directed at humans. Yesterday, one of our handlers swears Shadow was trying to say Ezra. The phonetic patterns match human speech attempts we've documented in captive marine mammals, but never in wolves." The drive to Colorado became a pilgrimage of scientific curiosity mixed with growing dread. Dr. Clearwater brought video recordings of Shadow's behavior with Ezra, hoping to provide context that might help facility staff understand the unprecedented nature of their newest resident. But nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him at the rehabilitation center. Shadow had lost significant weight in just 3 days, his magnificent coat dulled by depression that seemed to drain life force itself. When Dr. Clearwater approached the enclosure, the wolf's amber eyes showed recognition but no joy, no tail wagging, no signs of the gentle intelligence that had characterized his interactions with humans in Montana. Instead, Shadow moved to the corner of his enclosure where he had arranged pine branches and leaves into a pattern that Dr. Martinez confirmed he rebuilt daily with obsessive precision. "My God," Dr. Clearwater whispered, understanding flooding through him as he recognized the arrangement. "He's rebuilding Ezra's cabin." The layout, the proportions, he's trying to recreate home. The behavioral observation session that followed documented phenomena that would reshape understanding of animal consciousness and emotional capacity. Shadow's caretakers described how he had established daily routines that mirrored his life with Ezra, positioning himself at the enclosure entrance at newspaper delivery time, arranging his food bowl in the exact location where he had eaten breakfast with his human family, even attempting to bring pine cones to handlers in mimicry of the newspaper delivery behavior that had delighted Ezra every morning. We're witnessing psychological patterns typically associated with human grief and attachment disorders, Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled team of wildlife experts who had flown in to observe Shadow's unprecedented behavior. This wolf has formed emotional bonds that transcend species boundaries. His current state suggests that separation from his chosen family unit may literally be killing him. The implications were staggering for federal wildlife policy and animal rights law. If Shadow's behavior proved that wild animals could form genuine emotional attachments to humans that were psychologically indistinguishable from family bonds, then seizure and captivity might constitute a form of psychological torture rather than protective conservation. But the most devastating revelation came from an unexpected source. Agent Mitchell Kane arrived at the facility on Thursday morning, his rigid federal authority mask finally cracking under the weight of truths he could no longer ignore. In his hand, he carried a manila folder containing documents that would expose the personal vendetta that had driven his relentless pursuit of Shadow's seizure. "Dr. Clearwater, Dr. Martinez, I need to make a confession that could end my career," Kane said, his voice shaking with emotions he had suppressed for 2 years. "My enforcement of this case hasn't been motivated by federal protocol. It's been driven by personal tragedy that I let corrupt my professional judgment." The story that emerged painted Kane not as a heartless bureaucrat, but as a broken grandfather whose obsession with wolf eradication had been born from devastating loss. 2 years earlier, Kane's 4-year-old granddaughter Sophia had been killed during a family camping trip in Alaska. The official report blamed a wolf pack attack, but Kane's investigation had revealed a far more complicated truth that authorities had covered up to avoid liability lawsuits. Sophia wasn't killed by wolves, Kane admitted, tears cutting tracks down his weathered cheeks as he faced the professional colleagues he had deceived. She was caught in crossfire during an illegal wolf hunt. The hunters were using her family's campsite as bait to draw wolves into shooting range. When the pack came to investigate, Sophia wandered into the killing zone. The cover-up had been systematic and thorough. Federal authorities, embarrassed by their failure to prevent illegal hunting on protected land, had altered the incident report to blame wolf aggression rather than human negligence. Kane's department had suppressed evidence of the hunter's involvement, leaving him to believe that his granddaughter had been randomly targeted by predators. "I've spent 2 years hunting wolves because I thought they had murdered Sophia," Kane continued, his confession destroying the foundation of every federal case he had built. "My daughter Rachel cut off all contact because she said my obsession was destroying what was left of our family. She was right. I let grief turn me into something cruel and vindictive." The revelation recontextualized every aspect of Kane's pursuit of Shadow. His rigid interpretation of federal law, his dismissal of community testimony, his refusal to consider behavioral evidence, all had been driven by a grandfather's misdirected rage rather than professional duty. Shadow had become a symbol of the predators Kane blamed for Sophia's death, making the wolf's obvious gentleness and family devotion even more threatening to Kane's need for someone to blame. Dr. Martinez studied Kane with the clinical assessment of someone re-evaluating everything she thought she understood about the case. "Agent Kane, If your enforcement was motivated by personal bias rather than federal policy, doesn't that invalidate the legal foundation for Shadow's seizure? That's exactly what it means, Kane replied, pulling out his phone to make the call that would either redeem his tattered soul or end his federal career. I'm contacting my superiors to report my misconduct and recommend immediate review of Shadow's case. This wolf was seized based on contaminated evidence and personal vendetta, not legitimate federal wildlife concerns. The conversation with Kane's supervisors lasted 2 hours and resulted in an unprecedented decision that sent shockwaves through federal wildlife management circles. Shadow's seizure would be suspended pending a complete investigation of enforcement misconduct, with the possibility of returning him to Ezra's custody under supervised conditions that had never been attempted in federal wildlife law. But the most profound revelation came from Shadow himself. When Dr. Clearwater played recordings of Ezra's voice through the enclosure speaker system, the wolf's transformation was immediate and startling. His ears pricked forward, his tail began wagging with desperate hope, and he pressed against the fence with vocalizations that sounded heartbreakingly like attempts to call his human's name. "Ezra! Ezra!" The sounds weren't quite human speech, but they were closer to language than any wolf vocalization on record. Shadow had learned to communicate across species boundaries, developing rudimentary language skills that proved his intelligence operated on levels that challenged every assumption about animal consciousness. "We're not just dealing with an unusually socialized wolf," Dr. Clearwater announced to the assembled team of experts whose worldviews had been shattered by a week of unprecedented observations. "We're dealing with an individual who has developed cognitive and emotional capacities that blur the lines between wild animal and family member. Shadow has proven that love truly can transcend species boundaries, creating bonds that are psychologically indistinguishable from human family relationships." The decision to return Shadow to Montana came with conditions that would establish new precedents for human-wildlife coexistence. Ezra would be required to undergo training in wolf behavior and safety protocols. Shadow would be fitted with a monitoring collar that would track his movements and alert authorities to any concerning behavioral changes. Monthly visits from federal wildlife experts would ensure that the unprecedented arrangement served both conservation goals and individual welfare. But most importantly, Shadow and Ezra's relationship would become the foundation for research that could revolutionize understanding of animal consciousness and the possibility of genuine interspecies family bonds. Their love story had evolved from personal triumph to scientific breakthrough that might reshape laws protecting both wild animals and the humans who dared to love them. As preparations began for Shadow's return to Montana, Dr. Clearwater found himself grappling with questions that went far beyond wildlife management. If animals could form genuine emotional attachments that paralleled human family bonds, what did that mean for conservation policies that prioritized species over individuals? How many other shadow-like relationships had been destroyed by laws that failed to recognize love as a force that transcended biological boundaries? The answers would have to wait, but Shadow's amber eyes held promises of revelations that might teach humanity as much about the nature of love itself as they revealed about the mysterious depths of animal consciousness. The wolf who had chosen family over freedom was about to become the bridge between two worlds that had been kept artificially separate for too long. Agent Kane's final act before requesting reassignment was to place a phone call to Montana, his voice breaking with emotion as he delivered news that would resurrect hope from the ashes of institutional cruelty. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Agent Kane. I'm calling to tell you that Shadow is coming home. The federal transport vehicle that had carried Shadow away in chains of institutional authority returned to Ezra's mountain cabin on a crisp October morning, painted in autumn gold. This time, however, the atmosphere crackled with redemption rather than legal condemnation. Agent Kane emerged from the passenger seat carrying documents that would establish the first officially sanctioned human-wolf family unit in federal wildlife management history, his weathered face transformed by the peace that comes from choosing healing over hatred. Shadow's reunion with Ezra unfolded with the profound simplicity of love recognized across species boundaries. The moment the transport cage opened, the wolf bolted toward the old man who had been dying of loneliness until amber eyes had brought purpose back to his world. Their collision was gentle despite Shadow's size and enthusiasm. 120 pounds of pure devotion pressing against fragile human bones with the careful awareness of a creature who understood that some treasures required delicate handling. "Welcome home, family," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking with emotions too deep for adequate expression, as Shadow's massive head nuzzled against his chest. The wolf's tail wagged with the same single deliberate beat that had sealed their bond 18 months earlier, a gesture of recognition that transcended time and legal interference. Dr. Clearwater documented the reunion with scientific precision, but his clinical observations couldn't capture the metaphysical magnitude of what they witnessed. Shadow immediately resumed his protective positioning beside Ezra, scanning the assembled crowd of federal officials, media representatives, and community members with amber eyes that assessed threat levels while maintaining the gentle demeanor that had first challenged Kane's assumptions about predatory nature. The community of Cascade had transformed during Shadow's week in federal custody. Mrs. Henderson arrived with a casserole and tears of joy, finally understanding that love didn't require comprehension to deserve protection. Pastor Williams blessed the reunion with words about divine providence working through unlikely angels. Even the children who had initially feared Shadow's size now approached with drawings and homemade cards welcoming their guardian wolf back home. This arrangement represents unprecedented cooperation between federal wildlife management and individual citizens, Kane announced to the assembled media, his voice carrying authority earned through confession rather than rigid enforcement. Shadow and Mr. Whitmore's relationship will serve as a model for future cases involving exceptional human-wildlife bonds that serve conservation rather than threatening it. The legal framework that enabled Shadow's return had required creativity that pushed federal wildlife law into uncharted territory. Ezra's cabin property had been designated as a private wildlife sanctuary, with Shadow classified as an educational ambassador whose unique socialization would contribute to research in animal consciousness and interspecies bonding. Monthly behavioral assessments would ensure that the arrangement served both individual welfare and broader conservation goals. Emma Whitmore Sullivan watched her father's transformation with the wonder of someone witnessing resurrection. The broken man she had found after Shadow's seizure had been replaced by the vital person she remembered from childhood, his eyes bright with purpose and his voice strong with the confidence that comes from having something irreplaceable to protect. "Dad, I owe you an apology," Emma said, kneeling beside the chair where Ezra sat with Shadow's head resting across his lap. "I thought Shadow was keeping you from living in the real world. I didn't understand that he had become your real world, the only one that mattered." The GoFundMe campaign that had raised over $75,000 for legal expenses was redirected toward establishing the Whitmore Shadow Research Foundation, dedicated to studying exceptional human-animal bonds and advocating for legal recognition of interspecies family relationships. Donations continued pouring in from around the world, accompanied by stories of people whose own lives had been saved by animal companions that laws couldn't protect or bureaucracy couldn't understand. Agent Kane's personal transformation had become as remarkable as Shadow's rehabilitation. His phone call to his estranged daughter Rachel had resulted in their first conversation in 2 years, opening pathways to healing that grief had blocked with misdirected rage. "Dad, I've missed you so much," Rachel had said, her voice breaking with relief that her father was choosing love over vengeance. "Sophia would be proud of what you did for that wolf and his human." Dr. Martinez arrived from Colorado with behavioral reports that would revolutionize understanding of animal consciousness in academic circles worldwide. Shadow's attempts at human speech, his recreation of domestic routines, and his demonstration of grief patterns had provided scientific evidence that emotional bonds between humans and wild animals could achieve psychological depths previously thought impossible. Shadow has proven that love operates as a biological force that transcends species boundaries, Dr. Martinez explained to the research team that would monitor the ongoing relationship. His cognitive development during 18 months of family life suggests that animals may possess emotional capacities far exceeding our current scientific models. The evening celebration at Mabel's Diner brought together the entire Cascade community in acknowledgement that they had witnessed something miraculous disguised as a simple story about an old man and his wolf. Tables that had been divided by fear and legal concerns now hosted unified conversations about the nature of family, the meaning of home, and the possibility that love might be the most powerful force in any universe worth inhabiting. As autumn stars emerged over the Montana mountains, Ezra sat on his porch with Shadow positioned in their familiar companionship, the wolf's amber eyes reflecting ancient wisdom earned through trials that had tested the limits of institutional compassion. The cabin that had been transformed from tomb to home to empty shell and back to sanctuary again hummed with contentment that felt almost sacred in its completeness. "You know what you taught us, boy?" Ezra asked, scratching behind Shadow's ears as the wolf's tail beat slow rhythm against the porch boards. "You taught us that family isn't about blood or species or legal definitions. It's about choosing to love something so completely that losing it would tear pieces from your soul." Shadow's answering vocalization carried undertones that sounded remarkably like human language, not quite "I love you," but close enough to bridge the gap between worlds that had been kept separate too long. The sound echoed across mountain valleys where wild wolves howled responses that seemed to celebrate the return of their exiled brother, now serving as ambassador between wilderness and civilization. The story of Ezra and Shadow had evolved from personal triumph to scientific breakthrough to legal precedent, but its essence remained beautifully simple. Love recognized no boundaries, requested no permission, and required no justification beyond its own existence. Sometimes angels came with 4 legs and amber eyes, teaching humans that the greatest families were those chosen by hearts brave enough to love beyond all reason, all law, and all fear of loss that made such love both precious and eternal. Dear friends, after sharing Ezra and Shadow's incredible journey with you, I want you to know that this story isn't just about a remarkable wolf. It's about the truth we all carry in our hearts as we navigate these golden years of our lives. Like Ezra Whitmore, many of us have faced the profound loneliness that comes after losing a spouse, after children move away, after retirement leaves us wondering if our best days are behind us. But Shadow's story reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be waiting to be written. At 71, Ezra thought his purpose had ended with Sarah's passing. Instead, he discovered that love multiplies when we open our hearts to unexpected family, whether that's a rescued animal, a neighbor in need, or even strangers who become chosen family. Shadow showed us that it's never too late to make a difference, that wisdom earned through life's battles can become our greatest gift to others, and that sometimes the very act of caring for someone else heals our own wounded hearts. Your experience, your kindness, your capacity to love, these aren't diminishing with age, they're deepening into something more precious than gold. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you thought your story was ending? How has caring for others helped heal your own heart? Please share your stories below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.